remember we have two terms, hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Poiesis means to make something. So this literally means making the blood. Don't get hemopoiesis confused with hemostasis, confused with homeostasis. That's making blood. Basically making the formed elements. Hemostasis means stopping bleeding. So when your blood clots, you're performing hemostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining that internal balance. If you're specifically talking about making red cells, that's erythropoiesis. Remember we talked about erythropoietin? Okay. Erythropoietin is the hormone that stimulates erythropoiesis. If the oxygen level of the blood drops, the kidney releases erythropoietin. Erythropoietin goes to the bone marrow and says, make more red cells. Increase erythropoiesis. Leukopoiesis, production of white cells. Thrombopoiesis. I put production of platelets. It's actually production of the cells that make the platelets, but we'll get there. The bottom line is you get more platelets. Now remember that this is occurring in the bone marrow, right? So here's where you have some of those sinusoids. Some of those big capillaries, or the capillaries that have the big gaps, because if you've got, here's a bone. Here's the bone marrow, right? Marrow cavity. And so you've got all these little blood cells in here that are being made. You've got these blood vessels that come into the bone, right? And so these blood cells have got to get from the space of the bone into the bloodstream. Make sense? Well, you don't have just a empty, otherwise you've got all this blood bustling your bones. So you've got these blood vessels that go through here and through here and through all over the places. And so you have to have, the little capillaries have to have gaps where the blood cells can get into the bloodstream. All right, so these red cells, white cells, or platelets, they can squeeze in between endothelial cells, or even better yet, go through those big gaps in the sinusoids. They've got to get out of the bone marrow, into the bloodstream and stuff. Okay, I just thought that's a cool picture. Here's this would be like, and I never know, is it going this way or that way? I don't know. But anyways, here's an endothelial cell. There's another endothelial cell. And here's a red blood cell squeezing in between. I don't know if it's almost through or just starting. All right, now, you have stem cells in your bone marrow. Every once in a while you'll hear about somebody with a real severe form of leukemia having to have a stem cell transplant. So stem cells are what we call uncommitted. Another term is pluripotent. That means multi-potential. They have the potential to become anything. That's why stem cell research is so cool. Because if they can figure out, how to make stem cells become a liver, then you can have a liver. But in your blood, in your bone marrow, you have what are called pluripotent or uncommitted stem cells. That means that they can become any of these types of blood cells, any of these types of hormones. Now, they have to make a decision pretty quick. That pluripotent stem cell makes a decision. It divides, and it's either going to become a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. And at this point, it's beginning to limit its options. So here's the mother of all cells. And it divides, and it might become a myeloid stem cell, or it might become a lymphoid stem cell. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Now, If it becomes a lymphoid stem cell, the only type of cell that can come from this is a lymphocyte. Now, you probably learned in lab that there are 5 different types of leukocytes, right? Leukocyte is the big term. One of those is a lymphocyte. You've got neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, yeah, and basophils. Five types of leukocytes. A lymphocyte is a type of leukocyte. Now that means the rest of these blood cells come from this guy. This myeloid stem cell can eventually become a red blood cell, a neutrophil, an eosinophil, a basophil, a monocyte, or even the cells that make platelets. So the myeloid stem cell has lots of options. So here's your lymphoid stem cell over here. These are going to be lymphocytes. There's different types of lymphocytes. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the myeloid stem cell, basophil, eosinophil, neutrophil, monocyte, a megakaryocyte, which is where the platelets come from, and the red blood cell. Lymphoid lymphocytes, there's actually 3 types of lymphocytes. There's the B lymphocytes, the T lymphocytes, and then a small category called the NK or natural killer cells. Now notice that all of this stuff begins in the bone marrow, right? All of these cells, basically they all stay, they start in the bone marrow, they stay in the bone marrow, they're released from the bone marrow into the bloodstream. Lymphocytes start out in the bone marrow. The B cells travel to the lymph nodes. Remember when you go to the doctor and they say your glands are swollen? Those aren't glands, they're lymph nodes. The T cells start out in the bone marrow, and then they go to the thymus. Now the thymus is an organ that sits right above your heart, basically behind the sternum, on top of the heart. Thymus is not the same as thyroid. Thyroid's up here. Thyroid makes thyroid hormones. Thymus is lower. The thymus is large in children, and it shrinks as you get older. When we talk about the lymphatic system, we'll talk about the thymus and exactly what's going on with these lymphocytes. Okay? And that's why they call these T cells, because they go to the thymus. The B cells, you think, oh, it's why do they call them B cells? Because they first discovered them in a chicken organ called the bursa fabricia. All right, so that's where the blood cells, the formed elements, come from. Now let's talk briefly about each one of these guys. All right, the red blood cells, the erythrocytes. Their job is to pick up oxygen in the lungs and drop the oxygen off at the tissues. Pick up the carbon dioxide from the tissues and take it back to the lungs. Red cells are cool in a lot of ways. First thing they do, they look like kind of like the cheap lifesavers, the cheap gummy savers, you know? Because they have they're biconcave. They're not, most of the time we think about a cell, we think about a sphere, right? Although we now know that neurons are really weird looking and skeletal muscle cells are weird looking. But you know, your generic cell, round. These aren't. These are like taking a water balloon and pushing it on both sides. Now, guys again usually have a few more a few more red cells per microliter of blood. Wait, roughly 5 million. 5 million red cells per microliter. 1/1,000,000th of a liter. Holy crap. So let's think about this. On average, how many liters of blood do we need? 5-ish, right? So 5 liters of blood, that's how many microliters? 5 million, right? Everybody with me so far? So 5 million microliters of blood. Now, so in each microliter we have roughly how many red blood cells? Right? Okay, so the average person has that many red blood cells. Now, you did jumped into hematocrit, you did the little tubes in lab, we spun them down. Okay, so that's just the percentage of the blood that's made out of red cells. Again, guys tend to be a little bit higher than ladies. The reason is testosterone. Now, we talked about the fact that the red blood cells weren't spheres, they're actually biconcave discs. When a red blood cell is being made over here in the bone marrow, it has a nucleus until the next to the very last step. And the nucleus is spit out. It's actually, the nucleus gets ejected from the red cell. And then there's a great big, it's called a NER cell. It's a great big macrophage, type of white blood cell, that basically eats the nucleus and recycles the parts. You don't need, the nucleus will take up too much space. But basically a red cell is a bag of hemoglobin. Does that make sense? So if you had the nucleus in there, you couldn't put as much hemoglobin, so you get rid of the nucleus. Yep. Now, there's no nucleus, so a mature red cell can't reproduce because it has no nucleus. And so the bone marrow has to constantly be making new red cells every day. Makes sense? Makes sense? Has a reason. There aren't any organelles, no mitochondria, because the job of a red cell is to get the oxygen from the lungs to the tissues, right? If they had mitochondria, they'd use the oxygen up before they got there. So red cells, the only way they can generate the ATP that they need, and they do need some ATP, because they've got sodium, potassium pumps and all, you know, that kind of stuff. They can only do glycolysis. They only perform anaerobic metabolism. Cool? Okay. Now, as I said, red cells are basically big bags of hemoglobin. What's hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a big protein that's made out of 4 separate polypeptide chains. And so if you look cartoon of hemoglobin, you've got 4 globular proteins. You've got 2 alphas and 2 betas, but nobody cares. Yep. I mean, people care, but they don't care. We don't care. Each one of those proteins has a funny-looking organic molecule called a heme. So you've got a globin, excuse me. Well, globins. It's a globule, but it's a globin. A globin is a globule. That's the heme. It's called a heme ring. And inside, heme ring. And inside the heme ring is an iron ion, or an iron ion. So to make hemoglobin, you got to have 4 globins, 4 hemes, and 4 iron atoms, or ions. It's called a tetramer protein because there's 4 parts. So the whole thing is a molecule of hemoglobin. So you've got the globin, which is, it's a protein, right? So it's a chain of amino acids folded up. Sitting inside of that, you've got this structure, this heme molecule, and inside of the heme, you've got an iron atom. That's where oxygen sits. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. Each red blood cell has roughly, what does that say, 280 million hemoglobin molecules on board. Oh, great. All right, let's do this the easy way. This would be times 25. That's scary. I did it faster on the board than on the calculator. And I did it right. That's really weird. All right, so that would be 700 times 10 to the, what do you add those together? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Add the exponents together? A long time since I've done math. Higher math. All right. Or 7 times 10 to the 21st, right?
On your paper,
Y'all check me. Y'all know I'm bad at math. And each one of those hemoglobin, so that's how many in your body, the total number of hemoglobin molecules. Each hemoglobin can carry how many oxygen molecules? 4. Yes. We stand off the board and do this in front of people. So, in your body, at any one time, that many molecules of oxygen. Yeah, so that's basically the oxygen carrying capacity of your cardiovascular system. Now remember, think about this. Every 60 seconds, every single one of your red cells goes through your body. So you think every 60 seconds, that's how much oxygen, that's the maximum amount of oxygen being dropped off to your tissues. Anytime your oxygen sats drop, anytime that your blood can no longer carry roughly that much oxygen, you become anemic. So there's lots and lots of things that cause anemia. I used to teach a 6-week course, no, 4-week course just on anemia. The most common cause of anemia is iron deficiency. And you know why? If you don't have iron, you can't make hemoglobin, and you've got no place for the oxygen, you've got no seats for the oxygen inside the red cell. But how do you know you're anemic? Shortness of breath, that has nothing to do with your parentage. SOB is shortness of breath. All right, so at the lungs, oxygen goes on, carbon dioxide comes off. At the tissues, oxygen comes off the red cells, carbon dioxide goes on. Make sense? Now, we said the fact that red cells, you probably learned this lab, last about 120 days because they can't reproduce. They're basically like tires. Your bone marrow is spitting out these red cells, and they're going through the entire, what is it, how many miles of blood vessels? Yeah.
Okay, we don't have to.
I forgot, 60,000 miles of blood vessels or something like that every 60 seconds. So they wear out, just like your tires. Now, what happens is, just like your tires, oh, and that was the other thing I meant to say. Some of the capillaries are narrower than the red cell. And the red cell has to actually squeeze down. And so that because it's biconcave, you can do that. If it was a sphere, it couldn't squeeze. But since it's like a jelly donut, it can kind of bend over on itself and squeeze through those really, really narrow capillaries. And so that's another reason why they wear out. Now, you have fixed macrophages that are sitting in your spleen, in your bone marrow, in your liver. And just like you can look at your tires and go, man, I need to buy new tires, the red cells start to look weird as they get worn out. And so the macrophages basically eat those worn out red cells, those old red cells, and they recycle the parts. The globin is broken back down into amino acids. The heme, the iron, gets basically sent back, gets stuck on transferrin, which goes back to the bone marrow to make more hemoglobin. The rest of the heme molecule gets converted to something called bilirubin, but the important part is that rest of that heme, once the iron is taken out, gets converted to bilirubin. That's where bilirubin comes from.
Is that when babies are yellow?
Yeah, because what happens is this initial form of bilirubin is not water soluble, it's lipid soluble. And so if that builds up, well, let me tell you what normally happens. Once this bilirubin is made, it goes to the liver, and the liver basically adds a couple of molecules to it and makes it water soluble, and then it can be put into your gallbladder to make bile. That's what bilirubin is used for. But the problem is if the liver quits working, if something damages the liver, in babies, their liver's just not mature enough yet, it's not quite up to speed, and so you can have the jaundice baby. What happens is that bilirubin, since it's not been converted to the water-soluble form, It starts to deposit in the fat tissue in the skin, in the sclera of the eyes, and that's where you get the jaundice from. Any type of liver failure, any type of liver failure can cause you to become jaundiced, hepatitis, those kind of things. Anything that increases the number of red cells you're breaking down, like there's some things called hemolytic anemias, where the red cells rupture, that can make you become jaundiced because you're breaking down so much hemoglobin, you've overwhelmed the liver's ability to keep up. We call it pre-hepatic jaundice. It's jaundice due to something happening before the liver. That's free. You can have post-hepatic jaundice. If you get a gallstone and the liver, the bile can't get, bile basically backs up into the bloodstream, that can cause jaundice as well. That's all free. The important point here is that once you take the iron out of that heme molecule, the rest of it gets converted to bilirubin. That's where bilirubin comes from. Now, this goes back to what I was talking about with the red cells. You have one of those myeloid stem cells can become what's called an erythroblast. Remember, blast means immature cell. We talked about osteoblasts building up the bone, osteocytes taking care of the bone. Remember that? Okay. So, erythroblasts go through a whole bunch of steps. You don't have to know them. Okay? It's not a hematology class. But what happens is this divides, and this divides, and this divides, and then right here, about 4 days, the nucleus gets spit out. And this stage you do need to know. That's called a reticulocyte, a brand new red cell. Once it's gotten the nucleus out of it, a brand new red cell is called a reticulocyte. And you actually have about 1% of your red cells at any one point are reticulocytes. They're brand new cells released from the bone marrow. And in about a day or so, they become the regular mature red cell. Inside the bloodstream, yeah. There's a little bit of RNA left in here, and it kind of gives them a bluish tinge when you look at a smear. If you look at a blood smear and you count it around, you can see, oh, that cell's a little bit blue. That's a brand new one. That's a reticulocyte. And so about 1% of your red cells at any one time are brand new. They're reticulocytes. So if I've got roughly how many red cells? Oh Lord, we lost the number. Million microliters and 5. Let's do this the easy way. And then 1% of those would be to the 10th. Help me out. 1%. Yeah, 12%. Yeah. So not that many of the red cells are reticulocytes. So every day, that's about how many red blood cells your bone marrow is releasing into your bloodstream.
So then do they function already?
Yes, they function fine. They function fine. They're just brand new. So if you're anemic, and they say, well, the most common cause of, I give like poor insurance, then they'll say, go home and take some iron. And what they'll do is they'll come back and they'll measure your retic count. If you're anemic, your retic count's usually like 0.1%. And if they give you iron and all of a sudden the retic count shoots up to 5%, 6%, they know that the bone marrow is not able to make more red cells. If they give you iron and your retic count's still low, there's another cause of the anemia. Does that make sense? Okay. So normal retic count is somewhere between about 0.5% and 1.5%. If it gets lower than that, there's a problem. Your bone marrow is not able to make red cells for some reason. Now, this you already know. We already talked about this. We talked about it when we talked about blood pressure. If the oxygen level gets low, the kidneys are very sensitive. They have little receptors in there, little chemoreceptors that detect levels of oxygen. The kidneys release the erythropoietin. Erythropoietin says to the bone marrow, speed up the process. Make more red cells. Put more red cells into the bloodstream.